Good afternoon. My name is Curtis Valentine, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Reinventing America Schools Project and the 74. The Reinventing America Schools Project is housed at the Progressive Policy Institute and promotes a model of schools we call 21st century school systems, or systems that provide parents more choice and give schools more autonomy in return for more accountability. Our research shows that in urban America, public school systems that do this produce the most rapid improvement in student performance and in outcomes such as high school graduation and college enrollment. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss the impact and significance of disenrollment of students from America's public school system during the COVID crisis. Let's get started. Before we have our panelists introduce themselves, we want to survey those who are logged in today. We know you come from different perspectives on this topic, whether you're a parent, an educator, a funder, a journalist, an advocate, or a policymaker, and some of you fall in to more than one category. I know I do. The question is, which group do you most identify with? Answering this question will help our panelists sort of frame some of their answers to the questions that I have identified. What we're going to do now is ask our panel to introduce themselves, tell us about their work, but more importantly, how they're doing. I just want to be clear that we're having this conversation amid a larger conversation we're having in this country around the treatment of Black and Brown Americans. Yesterday's verdict was bittersweet for some of us, understanding that it necessarily wasn't justice, it was accountability for something we all thought and we saw firsthand. And so these conversations we have today and moving forward on education are mostly centered around Black and Brown children and low-income Americans. And so today, we think about what happened yesterday, the subsequent arrest of the other police officer in Minneapolis, and the investigation of another death of a high school student in Ohio yesterday at the hands of the police department. We need to understand not only what our students are going through, but what families and those who are listening in are going through. And so with that, we have this conversation. And so I do want to throw it to each of our panelists again to talk about how they're feeling right now and what they do and how they do it. And so let's start with you, Keri Rodrigues. Introduce yourself, your work, and how are you doing today?
Hi there, I'm Keri Rodrigues. My most important job is being Matthew, Miles, and David's mom, and Max and Dylan's bonus mom. I represent the National Parents Union. I was elected president back in January of 2020. And who knew a year later, we would be fully immersed in this work and bringing parents together, almost 15 million of them across the nation, to have a voice in one of the most unprecedented moments in American history. Period, let alone in education history. I'm excited to be here and for this conversation. I'm excited for this moment for parents and their agency and stepping into their power and participating in this conversation. In terms of how I'm doing, it's tough. Being the mama of 5 little boys in the middle of a pandemic is tough. The moment that we're in society right now is tough. And helping parents and families and communities across this nation is tough. I literally am coming to you after just moments ago, helping a family who is struggling when their biracial daughter had their hair cut in a school in Michigan, and they're struggling to get justice and figure out what the hell happened. There is so much to do in terms of reimagining education and in this moment that we're in right now, and I'm just pleased to be a part of this conversation with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Keri. Haley Korman, tell us about yourself and how you're doing today.
Hi, Haley Korman. I'm a senior associate partner at Bellwether, where I lead much of our work focused on the places where schools come into contact with other child serving systems. So I work on foster care, I work on homelessness, I work on juvenile justice, I do a little bit of work on immigration. What I'm thinking about today, the the thing on my mind, my identity that is feeling strong is, maybe to borrow Keri's term of a bonus mom, to 3 brothers, one of whom was shot and killed on the street in 2008, and another of whom is serving a 54-year sentence in a California state prison for a crime in which nobody was hurt. And today I am thinking a lot about solidarity and what it means to stand in solidarity with people, and reflecting on some simple framing questions that I like to use of, how is what I'm doing benefiting the people I want to be in solidarity with? Can they eat it? Can they pay rent with it? Is it making them safer? Can they access jobs because of it? And that's really front of mind for me today when I think about not just the work I'm doing right now around student attendance, engagement, and enrollment, but more broadly about how I move through the world.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Haley. Linda Jacobson, tell us about yourself and how you're doing today.
I'm Linda Jacobson. I write for the 74. My primary job is covering the federal government, but over the past 10 months since I've been with the 74, have covered a lot of these major stories around how students have been affected by the pandemic. I think I feel very honored, actually, how people have opened up and told me some of their stories over the past several months. I think my beat in some ways could be described as the people that are the hardest to reach. We've written about, those kids that have been disconnected from school and some of the challenges that they faced. And again, the fact that many have opened up and told me what they're going through has really been, an honor.
Thank you, Linda. Ray Ankrum, how you doing, man? Tell us about yourself.
Sir, first and foremost, thanks for having me. This is a phenomenal panel, and I'm looking forward to engaging. My name is Ray Ankrum. I am the superintendent of the Riverhead Charter School located in Calverton, New York. We're Hampton adjacent, about 12 miles from the Hamptons, but we're definitely in a high poverty type situation. But we don't use poverty as a crutch. Our kids are learning and performing better than students that are in affluent school districts, and I'm definitely proud to be the superintendent of the school. I'm also a co-host of the 8 Black Hands podcast, and so we bring good energy to the good people Sunday nights at 9 p.m. every Sunday, talking about educational issues and issues that matter us. In terms of how I'm feeling, I mean, bro, yesterday something happened. Shortly after that, something else happened, right? And so, although I'm elated at the fact that justice was served, I'm still thinking about all the times that justice wasn't served and all the future times in which justice will not be served, right? So this is a pinnacle moment for us in order for us to embrace opportunities to reform the police and also to reform schools. So that's my energy for today.
Thank you so much, Ray. And last but not least, State Senator James Coleman. Tell us about yourself, brother, and how you doing today.
Hey, Curtis, thank you so much for this opportunity. Really appreciate you. First and foremost, I'm a man of faith. I'm a husband. I'm a father of 2 children in 4th grade, James Jr. and Naomi, my son and daughter at a Highline Academy charter school here in Northeast Denver, here in Colorado. I serve as a state senator for Senate District 33, which is the airport where you fly into Denver all the way downtown to the 5 Points Historic African American Business and Cultural District. I'm also the president and CEO of Black Capital Foundation, a business that raises, invests, stewards, and expands capital into Black-owned businesses, and then also blessed to serve as the executive director at Faith Bridge, which is an educational equity organization here in Colorado. We provide food, we provide clothing, we provide technology to low-income families to help address the equity gaps. I'm feeling grateful. I'm feeling unsatisfied. I'm feeling shocked. When I heard the verdict yesterday, I thought that Derek's actions as a law enforcement officer were taken with his full expectation that regardless of the thousands who witnessed this moment live, that he believed he would not be held accountable for his crime against George Floyd. So when I saw the verdict, as did everyone else, I was shocked because that does not happen very often in this country. And I think that there are many instances where we have been given the same outcome, in particular in education, that I think people, criminal justice, education, you name it, I think people are just jaded, they're numb. But I'm optimistic, and I think yesterday, again, was a very small step in saying that we have an opportunity to rebuild America, to grow, and to be better people overall. And I think this conversation is great for us to talk about how we do that in education. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone for your thoughts. So let's get started. Since the start of the COVID crisis, school districts across the country saw attendance drop. According to the Washington Post, in North Carolina, more than 10,000 students had not been accounted for. New Mexico cannot account for more than 12,000 students at the start of the school year. Children who were enrolled before the pandemic, but never showed up in the fall. This month, the state's education department reported that 2,700 students were still missing. Haley, in that same article, you've said there's just a whole layer of kids who have just disappeared during the crisis. At Bellwether, you've been researching this phenomenon. How do you define the term disenroll, and what have you learned through your research?
Thank you, Curtis. It's a great question that I don't have a simple answer for. When we started doing our research, our analysis, it's titled Missing in the Margins, people can go and take a look at some hypotheticals, right? We asked ourselves, what would happen if, and we ran an analysis from there. And that came out of a realization that across the country, there were kids who were in the wind, right? Nobody knew where they were. They hadn't picked up a hotspot. They weren't logging on to classes. Maybe their families had moved and they had never enrolled in a new school. And as we started to dig into this question, we actually began to realize this phenomenon of disenrollment. When we think about the COVID-19 attendance crisis, it's not a yes-no binary, it's a spectrum. We think about two big groups of kids, the ones we think of as the missing. And missing can mean sort of minimally engaged in school, logging on, but not completing assignments, clicking in once a week, once every couple weeks. So there's already a gradation there that we know lots of districts are recording as in attendance, as enrolled, but we know don't match what we had historically thought of as attending school regularly. But those are all kids who would go to school tomorrow if they could, right? If school buildings opened or if they were able to get over the obstacle to online learning that they were experiencing, they would be there. These are kids who don't have digital access, kids who don't have secure housing, kids who are providing supervision for younger siblings, all of the reasons that it's just hard to get into an online classroom every day. And then there's a group of kids who we think of as the gone, kids for whom that transition away from school might be permanent. And those are often our older kids, 17, 18, 19-year-olds, sort of 13th year seniors who were a couple of credits away from graduation. For many of them, their life circumstances may have changed so much in the last 15 months that if schools were open tomorrow, going back isn't a reasonable option for them. Right? Things are so different in life. They're working full time. They may have had children of their own, that we need to be thinking differently about how to re-engage them in education. So we don't think about disenrollment. There is the completely checked out, not on anybody's roster anymore, disenrollment, but there is so much on either side of that that we think is a really important part of the conversation.
No, thank you for that. What we're going to do is find out who's in the audience for us. And so we do have the results from our first survey. 37% of those who answered the question are educators. And so we do have a large number of educators trying to better understand this question, I imagine, in order to better serve their students and their families. Another 32% were advocates, people who are in the community, pushing for change, wanting to better understand this topic. And so this is incredibly important. We're gonna go back to the survey. We wanna hear from parents in particular. Some of you all, fall in different spectrums, but many of you who are listening in are parents. And here's the question: did you seriously consider making a change of where your child was enrolled during the crisis? Meaning you were going to change the school your child was enrolled in prior to the crisis, during the crisis. We want to hear back from you to understand, the magnitude of the number of parents who seriously considered, put the research in, came very close to doing this, and so we'll hear back from those who responded really soon. Linda, I want to come to you. Fully virtual K-12 charter schools have experienced a pandemic-induced surge, as one sector observer put it. K-12 Inc., one of the biggest virtual charter school companies in the business, has reported a 57% enrollment increase, taking up to 195,000 students. Connections Academy, another very large online virtual charter school, has reported a 40% jump. According to the Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey, the percentage of US households with school-age children reported homeschooling spiked from 5.4% to 11.1% during the crisis. The figure is twice the number of households that were homeschooled at the start of 2019-2020. And so we're seeing a surge in virtual charter schools, in homeschooling during the crisis. Linda, you've been writing about this with the 74. What have you learned from your work about where these missing students are? Where do they go?
Well, when districts started to report some of these huge drops in enrollment and these huge numbers of students that they couldn't find this school year, I think there were some early assumptions about what was going on, that wealthy families were leaving to homeschool, that wealthy families were pooling their money with other families to create pods and hire, well-paid teachers. Like Haley said, that older students were just checking out and using this as an opportunity to not engage in school anymore. When we started to interview district leaders and families and students, we found a very mixed picture that really didn't point to one trend over any other trend. Families across the income spectrum were deciding to homeschool. Families across all income levels were joining pods, and not necessarily to leave school, but often to supplement what their school districts were doing with remote learning, because they felt it just wasn't enough. And then with some of those older students, we approached one story thinking that we were going to find students that had just left altogether to work and support their families. There certainly was some of that, but what we found was more common was students who were balancing both work and school, but this obviously complicated them logging into school every day. And so they often became part of that missing group, or significantly disengaged. And that was something we didn't really expect to find. We thought it would be one way or the other, but a lot of students were literally on the clock at work and logged into Zoom on their phones, with an earbud in. This led to a couple stories for us. One on just how students were trying to manage these situations. I talked to one counselor who would reach a student on the phone and they'd hear construction noises in the background. They're on a construction site. And then we did a second story about what some schools and districts were doing to try to keep up with these students. And sort of deploying staff members in new ways to check in with them weekly, to sort of intervene with teachers and provide, some flexible scheduling for them to get their work done. Another article that we did on some of the students that, Haley had looked into, some of these missing students were kids in foster care. We found that there's been huge sort of backlogs in the child welfare system that contributed to students sometimes in between placements with different homes being disconnected from school completely, that they would go weeks without being in remote learning in between these different placements. A lot of students in foster care also have disabilities, and distance learning just hasn't worked for them. They just could not engage at all in school. And yeah, definitely the shift toward charter schools is a big part of the story as well, both virtual and charter schools that aren't normally virtual. And those numbers have continued this school year as well, some of those increases.
Thank you, Linda. And we're gonna, talk about the experience that parents have, but also the decision to disenroll your child from a school and to make that shift, because it's not an easy one. I'm a parent of two. My wife and I, these are things that we consider in order to make the best decision for our children. But before we do that, we do want to go back to our poll results to find out how many parents who are listening in now actually considered removing their children. And so 40%, the majority said no, but literally 40% of those who are listening in seriously considered making a change in where their child was enrolled. And that's a pretty big number, understanding just what goes into removing your child from a certain environment and putting them into a new one. And so, Keri, we do want to come to you because the decision to remove a child from a school and family of teachers, educators, support staff is not an easy one. According to that household poll survey that I mentioned earlier, homeschooling rates increased most dramatically among respondents who identified as Black. The portion of Black homeschoolers increased fivefold from 3.3 in late spring to 16% in the fall. Keri, in your work with Black and Brown parents and the National Parents Union, what have you learned about the thought process parents go through to make the decision, but more importantly, the decision of where to enroll their children, whether it's private, charter, virtual, homeschool, or otherwise? You're muted there. Okay.
You hear me?
Okay, speak up a little. Thanks.
Hear me now. We felt that acutely at the National Parents Union. We actually funded the Black Homeschoolers Union in Chicago because we felt so strongly and felt the need of parents that were flooding these folks trying to get resources and support, because frankly, what it came down to for many of us was a crisis of confidence. I think you went through a period of grace where we were told that, first off, schools had it, that they were going to effectively communicate with parents. We've always been told by so many folks that school districts effectively communicated with parents what was going to happen, their resources, all of those things. And we could see very evidently that schools were not able to communicate with parents, especially poor Black, Brown, ELL families. They were not getting the information. They were not getting the resources. They were not getting the support to hook up hotspots and Chromebooks. So I think parents were willing to give schools and school districts and educators a period of grace. We were all saying, hey, we're in a pandemic, we're figuring this out for the first time. But then as we all returned to school last September, and it was very evident that even, during the summer break, there was not a lot figured out. There really was a crisis of confidence in a lot of these school systems, where parents were now saying, well, they really don't have it figured out. We can't really trust them on health and safety issues. We can't really trust them in terms of what we're seeing in remote learning. I mean, here in Massachusetts, we were fighting just to get above an hour of direct live instruction with the teacher every single day. It was crazy. The instruction that was given to our kids was far from adequate. And parents aren't stupid. This was playing out in our living rooms. And many of them made the choice saying, we can do this better ourselves, or there are alternative options. So what we're seeing right now is many parents have been to the promised land of seeing that there are options, there are opportunities, that the power is in their hands to make a decision about what's best for their children. And they're taking us up on that. So the real crisis is going to come down to, if systems want to re-earn that trust with parents and families, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to do the trustworthy things that you need to do to earn back that trust and rebuild that relationship? And do you even acknowledge the fact that that's been severely damaged and that there is a crisis of confidence that parents, specifically Black and brown families, have in these systems that frankly wasn't that great to begin with?
Thank you, Keri, Linda, and Haley, for kind of putting this in perspective from where we are and how we got here. I want to talk solutions. I want to talk what is working around the country, and we talked about this impact that this phenomenon is having on enrollment, particularly in schools of choice, like charter schools. We have a charter school superintendent and a charter school father right here in front of us, and so. Senator, I want to come to you, particularly what I'm seeing, what we've seen in Denver and in Colorado overall. The number of students attending Colorado's public schools fell by nearly 30,000 this fall. The first statewide enrollment drop in more than 30 years as families turn to homeschooling and other options. At the same time, of Colorado's 10 largest school districts experiencing the most dramatic year-over-year drops, Denver public schools saw the lowest drop of the top 10. In your home district of Denver, parents have a number of options, including traditional public charter, and innovation network schools. How did having those choices stem the impact of disenrollment in Denver public schools?
Thank you for the question, Curtis. Having a variety of choices, portfolio of options, I think it definitely helped. In Denver, families are, for the most part, in schools that they want to be in. So the pandemic didn't shake their initial loyalty. Because of an abundance of caution, our schools, despite their diversity, just didn't open up as fast as others. The pandemic was hitting all communities, but in Denver, a majority Brown and Black district, our families were at higher risk. So that caused leaders to thoughtfully pause when considering reopening. That caused us to introduce remote learning as our district moved to a real one-to-one tech tool reality. So that's caused a new choice now. Some families are expressing strong interest in maintaining remote learning. So the full impact on enrollment is yet to be settled, but we'll see how we adjust to this new choice that parents want. To your point, choice helped us to survive the initial wave of impact. But our ability to be nimble, create a new option, will determine the ultimate disenrollment in DPS. And while everybody in the ecosystem is a part of making that decision, I want to just again talk about what Keri discussed. I am in a position of leadership. Yes, I am a parent, but I'm in a position of leadership, and my responsibility, along with my school board, is to figure out a way to better listen to the parents, to better listen to the students, as well as listening to school leaders and teachers, which we have as well, about what was best for their students that we serve here in Denver. Thank you.
Can you talk? I mean, we have a couple seconds left. Can you talk a little bit more about your children's specific school and what they did during the crisis that really brought you and your wife to decide to keep your children in that school?
Yeah, my school did a phenomenal job. Our teachers in particular, in uncharted territory of figuring out a way to educate our kids remotely. We immediately began with virtual online learning as soon as COVID hit. We finished out their last school year, and then we started a new school year in 2020. And I think we were way better prepared in the new school year. Obviously, we had some experience, And then as we get ready to finish out this 2021 school year next month, we were able to go back into the classroom earlier this year. So the virtual learning, we stuck with it. We stuck with our teachers. We knew it was hard. I think we all, as we've heard many times, have a greater appreciation for our educators. Okay, I love my babies. Okay. But I'm grateful for my teachers because I know that they are in a classroom with someone who is professionally credentialed to do the job. So that's how our school handled it. I think going back into the classroom, of course, was all the COVID protocols, making sure that we had support from the community to be able to get back in. And that is parents talking to their students about how serious this is. And if we have an outbreak, guess what? We come back home. Our kids really wanted to be in school. A lot of our low-income families could not afford to have their kids at home. People lost jobs. So while I commend our schools and our teachers, our school leaders for figuring out a way to teach remotely, virtually, I also commend them for creating the protocols and putting things back in place for us to pick up where we left off before we went to virtual learning. To each their own, and our school handled that very well, and our children are back in the classroom.
Do you think that the autonomy your school had better prepared them for this compared to other schools in Denver?
Yeah, I think our school being able to make a decision on their own versus having to do what the district centrally desired for everybody to do played a big role in that. So the autonomy is a beautiful thing where they're not only on the hook and liable, more so for doing things the way that our school wanted to do, independent of the district. The district did provide supports and resources, but they're also to be commended again for having that autonomy and utilizing it well.
No, thank you. We want to come to you, Ray, a school leader with autonomy. Even before the COVID crisis, charter schools were known for their increased level of parental engagement. When the crisis hit, many charter school leaders had their staff knocking on doors, taking parent surveys, and creating relief funds to ensure families stayed engaged and enrolled, and in some instances saw their enrollment increase. Did your school see a drop or increase in enrollment over the past year, Ray? And what impact did the autonomy or freedom to make individual decisions about your school that comes with being a charter have on your ability to maintain or maybe even increase enrollment?
So that's a great question. Fortunately for us, we're in a pretty affluent area in terms of the district, in terms of the district that we're in, and in terms of the students that we that come to our school. And so what I mean by that is when you have certain people that are like, my kid needs to be in school, then districts listen to that more than they do like inner city and like in places where teachers unions kind of control the narrative. And so we were fortunate to be in that space. But with regards to us, there's really no red tape. So we talked to teachers, man. We brought teachers in, or like we got on Zoom calls and was like, hey, what's gonna make you feel most comfortable? And we surveyed teachers, and 70% were like, hey, we want to be back in the classroom. We want to be back with our kids. Like, we're doing this virtual learning thing, and that our middle school students are knocking it out of the park. But when it comes down to K-5, we know research tells us that those kids need to be in person to learn better. We were also seeing our L kids that were, not really performing the way that they perform when they're in person. And then also the most vulnerable population, special education students, were also struggling. And so we wanted to make sure that we were doing everything that we could in order to make things robust for our students. So, we made a decision early on to come back to school, using Wednesday as our day to like do a deep clean. But we were thinking outside of the box in terms of like what teachers wanted. So like we built apartments around our students. So like our students are like in like flexi glass cubicles or whatever, so that they aren't spreading COVID. And we're just taking huge precautions, listening to the CDC, everything except the 3 feet, because just wasn't with that. But you know, in terms of like keeping kids 6 feet, in terms of like putting air ventilation systems into classrooms and purifying air and doing all the things that teachers needed in order to feel comfortable. Because worst case scenario, if we come back and teachers don't feel comfortable, then good instruction is not happening and kids are not in a comfortable space. We also listen to our parents in terms of like, you know, parents had the need of kids returning to school, and we understood that. Fortunately for me, like my daughter attends my school, and for you charter school leaders out there that have kids of age, if your child is not in your school, shame on you. But you know, seeing her grow, seeing her, you know, want to be at school, having that desire or whatever, and then my desire to keep her safe also transcends in terms of like the 700 other scholars that I have and wanting to keep them safe as well. And so that definitely went into the thought process of putting together, you know, this robust plan in order to keep our kids safe, keep our teachers safe, keep our stakeholders safe. And so I'm not saying that it wasn't without fault. There were some classes that had to be shut down in terms of like, you know, if there was an infection or something like that. But compared to the local districts that we pull students from or whatever, like they were out 10 times more than what we were out, because we took the proper precautions in order to make sure that our staff was safe.
And so just to be clear, did your enrollment you were able to maintain?
Oh, I'm sorry. We never lose students. And so, you know, you may have a student that leaves like here and there, but we do a pretty good job of like communicating with our parents and being super transparent about, you know, what our expectations are, and then listening to our parents in terms of like what their expectations are. And we're able to like meet in the middle and usually form like the super team. So we didn't lose any students, to answer your question.
No, thank you. It would be simple to assume that this will go back to normal in the fall when school districts reopen in person learning. And we'll go back to business as usual. And there are folks right now who are cringing because they're like, Curtis, before the crisis, business as usual was, you know, we're hurting Black and brown students. But, you know, there is this assumption that, you know, when schools open back up, everyone who was disenrolled will re-enroll right back in the same school, and will sort of like maybe realize that we pushed pause for 2 years and nothing will have changed. Keri, is that a correct assumption? Are we going to think about this, look this fall and see all the students who were in those schools 2 years ago are going to be right back in the same seats?
Absolutely not. The data tells us that that's not going to happen. We have been doing national polling from the National Parents Union. I think this is our 16th survey that we're about to release throughout the course of the pandemic. And the numbers have been steady. By a 2-to-1 margin, parents are not interested in shoving their kids back in the same box. They view this as a moment to reimagine education. And frankly, they have a lot of ideas about what that should look like. They're very concerned about the impact that this situation is going to have, the long-term impact it's going to have on our kids. And they have some serious expectations around how our stimulus dollars are going to be spent, any additional ESSA funds that come down from the federal government. I think that because this is actually played out, again, in our living rooms, there's a different level of investment that has now come to pass. Like, people have seen their kids get robbed of education. They have seen their kids suffer directly in living rooms. And myself personally, I mean, I went through this with my child, Miles, who is my 3rd grader, who prides himself on being our boy genius and the smartest kid on the planet. He went from being a kid who was so excited about school to dreading remote learning. To the point where I had to go to our district superintendent and say, like, something's got to give with this kid. He will not even show his face on Zoom. So then we transitioned him to Florida virtual learning and said, okay, well, let's try this. This is a little more self-directed. And I woke up just after or just before February vacation here in Massachusetts, and I'm looking at my child, and it's 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, and he is 9 years old and dreading his life. And that's when I had to make a move. Here in Massachusetts, our charter schools are filled up and we're capped out. Charter schools, unfortunately, were not an option for us. I had to yank my kid out and put him in a Catholic school because I could not stand by and allow him to suffer one more day. The emotional turmoil I could see this kid going through, it reached a crisis point where I had to call it for this kid. And I think parents across the country are looking at all of these options. I am blessed, and thank you, God, that I have resources that I was able to get this kid into a Catholic school and pay for it. Not everybody has that. And not everybody has that option. Today, there are kids sitting in front of Zoom screens that are suffering, not because the science tells them that they have to be there, but because of politics. So I think parents have seen this situation politicized. They have seen who has shown up for their kids, who has underserved their kids. And I have seen parents in Momentum. I can't tell you, we have chapters that have been existing in all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico, and they are popping up every single day. Parents organizing, saying enough is enough. We can't believe that this is what our public education system is, and we want more and we want better. And the fact of the matter is, you know, parents don't often get into the whole governance battle the way we think we do, or the way that folks think we do, where it's charter parents versus district parents. You know, traditional district parents are finding out about charter schools and saying, oh my God, this is what we're looking for. Oh, expanded time spent on learning. My kid needs to catch up. This school is going to start earlier, you know, in August. Sign me up. How do I get in on this? How do I get to 5 days? How do I get more of this personalized instruction? They are finding out about it. And this is an unprecedented moment where we're having a very different conversation in the parent community about charter schools, about homeschools, about all kinds of options. So I would say to all of you, if you're an educator, if you're running a system, whatever it is, like, we're not interested in going back to the status quo. You don't have to take my word for it. Take a look at the data. We have literally provided and asked every kind of question of parents. What are you looking for? How do you want to see it? How do you envision it? What we're asking for is to be invited to the table, that this needs to be a co-creation, a collaborative process. Don't assume you know what we want. We're here to tell you what it is. In every community, bring parents to the table, ask what we think our kids need. We're willing to tell you and do this. But these relationships have been damaged, and we've got to acknowledge that. That's the elephant in the room here.
Mm-hmm. Haley, there are members of school systems right now who are cringing. I'm on the school board where I live here in Maryland, and every district in the country lost students in some way, I'm sure. What is your advice to district leaders who are, you know, trying to ensure that they do have these students return in the fall?
Yeah, I would take Keri's point about data just one step further and suggest to folks, I don't think it's a competing idea, but to orient around kids, not just parents, because there are kids in our systems who have needs that aren't visible to parents. There are kids who don't have parents, right? To Linda's point about kids moving through the foster care system, we have done some work around access to school choice for young people in foster care, which is an illustration of some of the policy barriers that can be in place for accessing school choice for many vulnerable populations of kids. To really be thinking about some of those high need student groups, like Ray mentioned, students with disabilities, English learners, for whom many of them were not getting the supports they needed to be successful in school long before the pandemic. And so finding ways that we are thinking about meeting the needs of young people, of kids, and the way that we do that, to Keri's point, is through data, right? If 50 is the average of 49 and 51. It's also the average of 0 and 100. And if we're only looking at aggregate data, we're only looking at enrollment numbers at a school, at a district, at the state level, we're gonna miss the kids on the edges, right? We're gonna miss those really high need, concentrated student populations. If instead, right, we think from the margins, we start thinking about what is that kid who is an English learner, who has special education needs and does not have an adult in the home who can help them navigate through these systems. How do I meet that kid's needs? How do I get them re-engaged in school? How do I get them on track? We're going to design solutions that meet needs for lots of kids, right? Rather than starting from that central 80% and sort of worrying about the edges later. Let's start from the edges and see how far that gets us.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the things that we did in terms of just getting those kids that were going to fall through the cracks is that we reallocated our deans of students. So when we were doing virtual, we had those guys, they were going around and like whoever wasn't signing on or whatever, they were showing up to their houses or whatever, just asking questions like, hey, is this a technology thing, or what can I do to help or whatever, in order to kind of, re-engage those students. I think districts, charter schools, whoever's educating kids, we got to think outside of the box in terms of like how to re-engage parents, and we also have to listen to parents. So thank you for that. That was.
And I just want to give you the flip side of that with Miles. Okay, when I made the decision to yank Miles off his remote learning, it was because he came to me and says, "Mommy, my teacher doesn't care if I'm on Zoom. She doesn't know." And you know what? I didn't believe him. I said, "Oh, it's boxes. It's hard." I sat with them. I told him on a Sunday night, I said, "Honey, you don't have to go on Zoom anymore," because it was making him upset because he felt like he was invisible and wasn't seen. I didn't get an email from that teacher till Thursday night, noticing that my child was not on Zoom. So the flip side of that, which was happening in his traditional district school, is atrocious. And that broke me and my relationship with that teacher. You don't care about my kid, and that's not something that's easy to earn back.
Linda, from a journalist perspective, what are we missing? What story needs to be told about what the fall, about re-enrolling these students back in the schools, about the future of education as relates to what we've learned over the last few years? What stories are you thinking about?
I think one of the things that we also saw was families that literally did move into, other districts so their kids could get into in-person learning. I talked to one school district that this was about an hour or so outside of the Twin Cities in Minnesota. And a teacher was saying, we've got all these new kids in our district that I've never met. These so-called Zoom towns where parents could work from home, but they wanted their kids to go to school in person. Will those families move back to their metro areas? I think that's one question. It's probably unlikely, if they've picked up and moved. I think another issue that's getting a lot of discussion right now is whether districts will continue to allow some kind of virtual options in the fall. I know the New Jersey governor has already announced, we're not going to allow that. Everybody's going to be back in person. If you take a hard line like that, will that be an incentive for some families to continue to move into, virtual charters? Is that something that the Biden administration is going to, take a stand on, or that other governors will take a position on? I know that there was some RAND data showing that about a fourth of districts were planning to continue to have some kind of virtual academy this fall. It might look different than what virtual school has looked like this school year, but a lot are talking about, we want to continue to accommodate the different choices that families have, to provide more choice after everything that has happened this year. So
Curtis, I know this is supposed to be like a professional panel, but y'all ain't gonna sit here and act like this panel ain't fire, man. Okay, Keri, Haley, Linda, Ray, y'all all talking right. The question is, why would we go back smiling to what was failing us? Have we dealt with structural and systemic racism?
Absolutely not.
Have we dealt with the discipline disparity?
No.
Let's not ignore that Black parents have been crying out that our kids were suffering pre-pandemic. There's no going back to the same box. And no one who really cares about children should be okay with any district that only wants to do business as usual. I'm sorry, Ray. I just had to say this panel fire, man.
No worries. But I want to piggyback off what you're saying. I think that Zoom is kind of like the great the great equalizer in a sense, right? Because parents that couldn't come to school and sit in the classrooms can now work from home and hear everything that a teacher's saying. So if a teacher's getting out of pocket with their kid, talking to their kid in ways in which they don't talk to their kids, they can now pull that teacher up and be like, listen, I don't talk to my kid that way. You're definitely not going to talk to my kid like that, right? And so for me, I'm an advocate for Zoom. I think that we're going to take it with us moving forward. And then we're also going to try to recruit homeschool folks, right? So like, you know, if we can get homeschool folks and like, hey, listen, this is less work that you have to do. You can use our curriculum. This is the time for us to reimagine education. And we're talking about reimagining education. You got to think outside the box in terms of like what's your draw and what more you can do for kids, right? We never have to have a snow day. Long Island is never getting another snow day ever again because we can now accommodate our kids. And then think about the kids that are absent, right? A kid is absent. You have a Zoom lesson. You can now go back to that recorded lesson as opposed to coming in and having the classroom helper hand you a ditto or something like that, which you know nothing about, and that the teacher's probably not going to have time to like reteach it or do anything of the sort, right? Now you can go back to that recorded lesson and you can get that instruction that and ask directed questions in terms of like what you may or may not know. This is an exciting time for education, and I will not let anybody kill my joy.
Ray, why you gotta be so mean? We're not killing snow days. Come on now.
Killing snow days.
No,
So Ray and James, really quickly, and you know, our last 10 minutes, I want you all to respond to just a question really quickly, because I do want to leave time for final thoughts. I want to talk dollars and cents, and I want to talk incentive for change and sort of what is going to light a fire under folks to make the change. And a lot of time it's going to come down to dollars and cents. Every October, Colorado State Education Department and a lot of state education departments around the country count the number of students attending public schools and allocate funding on a per pupil basis.
Yes, sir.
Average allocation of schools per student for the 2020-2021 academic school year in Colorado is close to $8,000, $7,985. But when kids leave for another school or homeschooling, money leaves too. That money's in that book bag, Ray. Now you talk about that all the time.
As it should.
So Ray, disenrollment means real money for schools like yours, especially charter schools that receive a fraction, even though, especially because charter schools receive a fraction of what traditional public schools receive. That's a whole other conversation. You all are kind of doing a lot more with less.
Yeah.
Does this create more urgency for charters to be responsive to parents because that cash incentive for enrollment is so important?
I mean, honestly, money kind of exasperates the fact that you need to be in tune with parents, but just being a good person, being a good leader should be your drive in terms of like engaging parents, right? And so, you know, I always look at it from the perspective of if we don't have parents, then we don't have schools, and if we don't have schools, then we don't have jobs, right? So like, you know, when you go into, I retail it, right? So like when I go into my favorite retail store, I go back because of the customer service, right? And so that's how parents should feel when they come into schools. They should feel welcomed when they come into schools. They should feel like, hey, I know I'm welcome if I come to this school, so therefore I'm going to come back, right? And so we need to start looking at parent engagement, not through the eyes of like the white middle class, because that's how we look at everything, right? We need to start meeting parents where they are. And when I say that, I mean, you know, if a parent doesn't come to your boring back to school night, which they're not going to learn anything from anyway, right? Because they have 3 jobs in order to remain from being in poverty, right? You'll have a high percentage of teachers that look down upon parents like, oh, they don't care about their kid. So I don't care about my kid because I didn't come to your boring back to school night, right? But now, you know, if you do it via Zoom, I can be possibly working at my job. I can have my earbud in and I can hear everything that you're saying so that I know moving forward that your class is a snooze fest. And here are the things that I need to do in order to supplement my child's education because I know they're not learning in your class. And so, you know, we just got to think outside the box in terms of like where we meet parents and like, you know, welcoming parents.
Senator, do charter schools who, you know, again, enrollment is important, incredibly important, especially because there's tuition and per pupil funding aligned with it. do charter schools have a greater incentive to create urgency around being responsive to parents, especially the one your children attend?
Absolutely. Per pupil funding requires that all our schools are not just responsive, but are proactively engaging and partnering with parents to create great schools. So it should just be about customer service. It should just be about shared responsibility. Parents want to be partnered with, not placated to. And we can sniff out fake faster than anything. All schools should be working to better engage families from the start and consistently for the good of students. I was on a call just last night. Shameless plug, shout out to Vernon Jones, Northeast Denver Innovation Zone leader. We have a number of schools in Denver in an innovation zone, as we do charters and others. Last night, this brother had 500 people on a Zoom, just to the point that Ray made. There are some people who can't show up. Silver lining of COVID sucks. The silver lining is we all on virtual now. And the blessing of that, though, is that there are people who could have never shown up and engaged with their schools in a way that we can right now. So to have the conversation last night with, it wasn't all parents, but it was parents, it was school leaders, it was teachers, the ecosystem, 500 people, powerful. So I absolutely do think that it creates more urgency, and some of the pressures that we get here in Colorado regarding innovation zones, charter schools, it's not about out of fear, okay, that we're not going to get the resources we need, that we're not going to get as much because we may be schools of choice. It's about a sense of responsibility. And I love what Ray said again. All parents care about their kids. I don't care. I'm not here to judge whether or not a parent cares about their kid. Priority for me is different because I'm blessed to have a wife, a mother-in-law who I love, because not everybody loves their mother-in-law, who's at home, who can help with the kids. But if I was a single parent dad and I'm working 2-3 jobs, it's gonna be hard for me to get there. So I appreciate folks creating opportunities for folks to get engaged in a real way so that we can figure out a way that all of our schools have the resources, but especially the ones that sometimes don't get as much resources as others.
Thank you all. This has been an amazing panel. We have 5 minutes left. Each of you are going to get 45 seconds to give your final thoughts. And I want to answer one question. What lessons can local and state leaders learn about how school leaders responded to this crisis as it relates to enrolling students and keeping students enrolled? What's that lesson learned? 45 seconds. Let's start with you, Haley.
All right. I would say that I think a lot of what it has taken and will take to keep kids engaged, especially the kids with the most concentrated needs, is time and resource intensive. And that need will continue to exist long into the future. It is something we needed to be funding 30 years ago. And so as we think about putting resources towards support for our most vulnerable students, talking to school leaders, understanding from them what they did, what worked, what it took, and how we resource that into the future so that we can keep doing it.
Linda, recommendations.
I think some of the more compelling stories for us were how school districts redesigned some positions, whether it was bus drivers or school office staff or cafeteria staff, to keep in contact with students and families, adding these sort of new roles to their positions because they weren't doing what they would normally have done anyway if students were in the building. And whether those types of models will continue. I think, in a lot of ways they've been effective at staying in touch with kids and making kids feel like somebody does care if they sign on to Zoom. And those have been interesting to watch, and will those continue?
Ray, talk to us. Recommendations.
So my recommendation is that you listen to the parents, right? That's how I want you to walk away from this. Recommendation for districts and for charters is to listen to your parents. Shameless plug here. Senator Coleman, we would love to have you on 8 Black Hands podcast so you can come and announce your run for governor. But yeah, definitely listen to the parents.
Speaking of parents, Keri, what's your recommendation?
Stop treating our children like per pupil expenditures and start treating them like students. Just because we're poor, Black, and brown doesn't mean we're stupid. We know why you care about disenrollment is the money that comes along with it. We're not dumb. And that's the same argument we get into around charter schools. Like, oh my God, you're taking our money from us. No, 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 no. Like, everything has been disrupted. The status quo has completely been disrupted. Parents are powerful. And again, unless you listen to us and bring us to the table, like, we're not going to engage with you. We've been to the promised land, and we're not stupid. We see you coming.
Final thoughts, Senator Coleman. Let's take us out, brother.
Appreciate you, Curtis. Appreciate you, Ray, for that plug. Listen, we need to ensure that our schools are equipped to be nimble and responding to the right now needs of families. While central offices are figuring things out, school leaders have families knocking at the door, and they have to be trusted with the plan. I mean, have the ability to call audibles based on the needs in front of them and be given the tools to serve students and families well, even in pandemic predicaments. We have to avoid believing that our brilliance and best ideas are centrally located. Trust the leaders. Trust that you have prepared them well. Now, if you haven't prepared them, that's another story and an area for improvement. But we need to be sure that our schools are not just COVID safe, but pre-COVID safe. Our Black and brown kids going back into buildings that are affirming their humanity, that believe in their greatness, that are aligning in their promise, that are helping them realize their hopes. There were plenty of viruses pre-COVID that need to be eradicated from our schools so that our children can truly thrive.
Yeah.
Perfect way to end an amazing panel. Thank you to Haley, to Linda, to Ray, to Senator Coleman, to Keri for your insight, for your experience, for this conversation. Here at PPI, we believe autonomous schools work. You saw examples of that and how that autonomy allowed many schools to respond to this COVID crisis. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and you all have an amazing afternoon. Thank you.